Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me clearly, but I think from last speakers that was the case. Just make sure. Okay. Today I'll be talking to you about some legal aspects of smart grids, some opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. I'll go a bit quicker on the first part because in the earlier presentations we've heard about it, and I'll be focusing on the current legal framework. And when I go from a European level to a more national level, it will be Flemish level because, as you know, it's smart grids. It's mostly related to distribution level, for which Flanders is competent. So. Yeah, I guess there's no need to give a further definition now on smart grids and on the benefits of them. I think most important issue I wanted to highlight in this slide, which I will pick up on later on, is the fact that smart grids also focus a lot on the demand side aspect and on demand side response. Also, the issue on smart metering and the progress in EU with the 80% objective has been discussed. Maybe one more thing which is interesting here to say is that most EU member states are addressing the distribution system operator, so the DSO, as the data manager for smart grid information. Only a few member states, among which I think UK and Poland, they're working with an independent central data hub. So the current EU legal basis for smart grids, it's indeed a lot based on soft law. So it's words like in the Third Electricity Directive, strongly recommending making an economic assessment, leaving it to the national member states to decide whether or not and how far to implement it. Equally, Renewable Energy Directive encourages the member states to take appropriate steps for the implementation of smart grids and more particularly the integration of renewables, so small production units into the grid. Energy performance building also uses terms like encourage, also quite soft. And then the Energy Efficiency Directive is a bit more stringent, saying that with regard to smart meters then, that even if member states would not opt for smart meters, that still they have to ensure that for final customers they have competitively priced individual meters that can accurately reflect the final consumer's actual energy consumption. So ensuring that even if member states would not opt for smart meters, that still metering is close enough to allow for the integration of smart grids. Indeed, the Third Electricity Directive in its Annex 1.2 also refers to interoperability, which is not really defined in a legal way, but in a more regulatory literature on the topic. It has to do with standardization and develop standards for smart meters. This is also done in a more soft law legal way in the sense that on EU level a smart grids task force has been created, which has been issuing a lot of reports on possible standards for smart grids. I had a quick look into those documents, but they're really very technical, so they're more for technicians, a very interesting topic than for lawyers. What is interesting though for lawyers is how smart grids can be qualified, and more particularly whether they are qualified as a distribution grid or not. Because as you know, distribution system operators, they have a monopoly, and if smart grids are a distribution grid, well, basically they are part of the monopoly of the DSO. The Electricity Directive defines distribution grid. It's not defined, but distribution itself is defined as a transport of electricity on high voltage, medium voltage, and low voltage distribution systems with a view to its delivery to customers, but does not include supply. It's quite a vague definition, but the CEU, which is the High Court of European Union, has ruled clearly in its CityWorks case that distribution and distribution grids is to be interpreted largely, and so there is a general legal consensus that smart grids are distribution grids, and thus that in principle they are part of the monopoly of the distribution system operator. That does not mean that the story ends here. There are still opportunities for SMEs in several roles to participate in smart grids. Firstly, there is the task of a DSO to ensure the long-term availability of the distribution system and to meet reasonable demands of distribution of electricity. It's not defined as strictly an investment obligation as it is for the transmission system operator, but legal case law and doctrine agree that meeting the reasonable demands implies a certain need of investing in the system, e.g. to allow the integration of renewable energy. Furthermore, I told you about the monopoly of the DSO, but there are a few exceptions to it. Two exceptions, direct lines and closed distribution grids, which are particularly interesting in case of microgrids, of which we talked earlier, or on small business parks. So the installation of a direct line or a closed distribution grid, it's in principle it's prohibited, but in Flanders one can obtain an authorization of the VREG, the regulator, which will get advice of the distribution system operator. It's an economical advice and assessment of inefficiency, risk, security, impact of tariffs, because obviously if everybody starts building closed distribution grids, then nobody is paying anymore for the general distribution grids, and the few consumers that are still left on it, their tariffs will skyrocket. So, but there are a few exceptions, and obviously in a few cases for small business parks or whatever, the microgrids, it's certainly worth it to consider the construction of a closed distribution grid.
Microgrids, what are there no rules?
There are few rules. You have to construct them with either a direct line or a closed distribution grid, but in principle, you cannot. Currently, you cannot uncut your home from the grid, so you cannot operate. So, well, there's micro and really micro, but the regulation hasn't evolved.
I don't want to be cut off from the main supply, but in my home, I can do what I like.
To a certain extent, after your meter, but then we're now tackling, and I'll come back on it later. It's the case with the solar panels on the roof, and that your neighbor is paying for your solar panels, and then we're working on the tariffs there, but I'll come back to it later how to solve that. Smart meters. Maybe I'll go quicker on that one, because in Flanders there isn't much yet. There's a framework, but there's no real implementation. There's some advices of the VREG, but it ends there. So we have the monopoly of the distribution system operator, with a few exceptions. Still means that on a production or a demand side management storage aspects, one can connect to the grid and be part of the smart grid evolution. With regard to the entry of the market, there's obviously the free choice of supplier for any consumer and or producer, which implies some freedom already. There's also the non-discrimination obligation of the distribution system operator, in a sense that if person A and person B request access to the grid, he may not discriminate clearly by saying you don't get it, but he may also not discriminate by saying to person A, I'll give you a rebate on the tariffs because I like you, and to the other one I'll apply the standard tariffs. It's quite sensitive. Which is also interesting here is that a new technical regulation is being developed, well actually has been developed by the VREG, by the Flemish regulator, to implement further the Energy Efficiency Directive. It has been approved by the VREG, but it still needs to be published into the Belgisch Staatsblad, so the Moniteur Belge, before it becomes official, which hasn't been done yet. And one of the new concepts which is introduced in this new technical regulation is the flexible access to the grid. The flexible access, it will be, it has not, well, flexibility has nothing to do with an interruption of the grid tension because of an N-1 situation or whatever. It also has nothing to do with different time frames for the net tariffs or with an obligatory deconnection of the grid by the distribution system operator, but it is the ability and the willingness of a grid operator in a normal grid situation, so in an N situation, to adapt his injection and its consumption behavior. And so we're evolving there to a principal possibility. Well, there would be a Netflix study which then would qualify you as green. You can participate to the flexibility. Orange, it's a conditional participation of, or red, you can't. I spoke to you on tariffs. Tariffs are obviously also a very important part to determine how you can participate in the smart grids, but also who is paying for the what is left of the distribution, the classic distribution grid. We always had, or we have long have load-based tariffs based purely on consumption, so not taking into account if you have solar panels and you generate your own electricity and you consume it, you're basically not paying any tariff, so you make a double net profit. Also, injection-based tariffs have been have long not existed, but there are a few possibilities. For example, now in Flanders there's the prosumer tariff, so it's a capacity-based tariff which no longer takes into account the amount of energy you consume or inject, but it's capacity-based, so based on the installed capacity of your installation. It's only for solar panels now, so below 10 kilowatt hours. And then there's the Flemish coalition agreement, which stated that the tariffs should reflect the capacity which is reserved by each grid consumer. Obviously, the regulator or the legislator, so the Flemish government, can give some incentives, but in the end it will be the energy regulator, so the VREG, who will decide on the final tariff structure. Another interesting thing for participating in the smart grids market may be buying your electricity via BELPEX, not only because in long term you may have lower tariffs or, well, really consumption, electricity prices to pay, but also because you could adjust your behavior by producing when the price is high and by taking less often when price is high, and so on. Not everybody can participate to BELPEX, or at least not everybody can participate directly to BELPEX. So there are certain contracts you require, among which an ARP contract with Elia, but there is a possibility to participate as an indirect participant, so to have a broker acting for you, which will usually be an ARP. So there may be a case for you to participate, especially if you have like a CHP installation. For energy service companies, there may also be a role. Most importantly here is, and there's no real regulation in this regard, but is to prevent the unfair competition of distribution system operators. Why? Because obviously by being a distribution system operator and by having the monopoly and by having access to a lot of metering data, even data which may not strictly be required for your function as a distribution system operator, you may have a competitive advantage with regard to ESCOs. There's also an intention to solve this problem and to further work on it, both on a European level as on a national level, which may consist in a non-discriminatory access or a trade of data via a central and an independent data management system. Finally, from a legal point of view, and it's not really a setback, but it's just something one has to bear in mind, is that there may be issues with security and privacy. So in the smart grid, a lot of data are being traded. First, there's the competitive market issue and the liberalization, where there's some protection and confidentiality on sensitive data. Data which either fall under the data protection directive, which are personal data, or commercially sensitive data. It's not prohibited to collect them, but if you do, you either need a consent of the person you're collecting them from, or at least there needs to be some kind of justification. There's a list in the directive, and then obviously the reason why you're collecting them and the amount of data you are collecting need to be proportional one to another. Security of networks, it's more regulatory stuff in the sense that obviously smart grids may be open to cyber threats and stuff like that, so there may be regulation to be provided there as well. And then privacy issues I already told you about. There's also further EU initiatives on that one, data protection impact assessment, which further, well, kind of specify the issues which are set out in the data protection directive to smart grids. So from a legal point of view, there's the monopoly of the distribution system operator, which is there to stay, but doesn't mean that there aren't any opportunities for SMEs. From a renewable point of view, from offering flexibility as an ancillary service, reducing your demand. There's some issues there, but there's also problems to be solved, tariffs, the security and privacy issues. So, thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions.
I have a question. I think it was 4 or 5 slides ago on direct line.
Yes. Yep.
Microgrids. So if I understand you well, microgrid is not an exception.
No, it is. It is.
Because it's a different.
Yeah, it's a different bullet point, because in a perspective of smart grids, that may be the most interesting thing why you may need the exceptions, or why you may need the issue from deconnecting yourself or having your own private distribution grid. It also depends obviously on what you define as microgrid. If you scale it down to a house, then it's just everything which is behind your connection point. It's not part of the grid anymore, so basically you do what you want. If you say a microgrid, it's just 4 or 5 companies which are on the same place, and they can create a system where they can well, control excess energy or distribute it among each other, then we're working with the direct lines and closed distribution grid systems.
Correct. But microgrids you can also have in the industry.
Yeah, sure.